Emma had always believed she had the perfect marriage. David was successful, charming, and provided her with a life most would envy. Their countryside estate was vast, peaceful, and surrounded by rolling fields. But perfection had its cracks, and hers had been widening for years. David's business demanded constant travel. At first, the distance had been bearable. Absence made the heart grow fonder, or so she had thought. But as time passed, his departures became routine, and his returns felt more like brief intermissions in a life that revolved around his schedule. Conversations turned into check-ins. Affection was now an obligation rather than a desire. The house was silent most days, except for the sounds of nature and the rhythmic clatter of hooves from the stables. Midnight was her escape, her beautiful black stallion, strong and untamed. She had raised him since he was a foal, his presence a constant in her ever-changing world. When she spoke to him, it wasn't about logistics or finances. She whispered secrets into his mane, pressing her face against his warm neck, feeling a connection deeper than words. She would spend hours with him, brushing his coat, riding across the fields, feeling free in a way she hadn't in years. Midnight didn't demand anything from her. He didn't leave. He didn't forget to say goodnight. He was there, steady and loyal, in a way David no longer was. Loneliness wasn't something Emma had admitted to herself at first. She had told herself she was simply independent, that she enjoyed solitude. But there was a difference between being alone and being unseen. And David had stopped seeing her a long time ago. Tonight was no different. The sun had set, casting a deep amber glow over the estate. She sat by the window, wine glass in hand, scrolling through old photos on her phone. Smiling faces, vacations, anniversary dinners. Moments that once felt real but now seemed staged. David had texted earlier. Meeting ran late. We'll call tomorrow. She hadn't bothered to reply. Sighing, she set the glass down and pulled on her riding boots. The stables were quiet, the scent of hay and leather thick in the air. Midnight stood in his stall, ears twitching at her approach. "Hey boy," she murmured, running a hand down his neck. "It's just us again." His dark eyes met hers, as if he understood. Maybe he did. She saddled him up, leading him out into the open field. The wind was cool against her skin as she climbed onto his back, gripping the reins. Midnight took off, his powerful strides carrying her into the night. For a moment there was no marriage, no empty house, no neglected heart. Just the rhythmic gallop, the rush of wind, the quiet thrill of escape. She leaned forward, pressing her body close to his, whispering, "You're the only one who's ever really been here, aren't you?" Midnight didn't answer. But in the silence she already knew. The morning air was crisp as Emma walked toward the stables, the scent of damp earth still lingering from last night's ride. She had barely slept, her mind restless, her body aching for something she couldn't quite name. Midnight was already awake, his dark eyes following her every move. She ran a hand through her hair, sighing. Another day. Another stretch of silence. She was about to grab the brush when a voice behind her made her freeze. "Morning." He turned. A man stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his gaze steady. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-kissed skin and a quiet confidence that made her pulse jump. "You must be Emma," he said, stepping forward. "I'm Liam. Your husband hired me to help around the stables while he's away." Course. David had mentioned it in passing, something about hiring extra hands to manage things. She had barely paid attention. Now, standing in front of Liam, she wished she had. His handshake was firm, his hands rough, the kind that had known real work. Midnight nudged him, and Liam reached out without hesitation, stroking the stallion's mane like he had done it 100 times before. Midnight, usually wary of strangers, accepted it. "You have a way with him," Emma said, watching the easy interaction. "Horses don't lie," Liam replied, his eyes flicking to hers. "They know who they can trust." The words sat heavy between them. Over the next few days, Emma found herself drawn to the stables more than usual. Liam was always there, working, fixing, riding. He was skilled, confident, and moved with the ease of someone who belonged in the world of horses and open fields. And unlike David, he noticed things. "Didn't sleep well?" he asked one morning as she struggled to saddle Midnight. She hesitated. "Just restless." "Yeah," he said, adjusting the strap for her. "I get that." It wasn't just his words. It was the way he said them, like he understood something unspoken. The way his fingers brushed against hers, lingering just a second too long. The way his eyes held hers, steady and unreadable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, she found him leaning against the fence, watching Midnight graze. "You ride at night a lot," he said, not looking at her. She crossed her arms. "It helps me think." "What are you thinking about?" She hesitated. "Everything." "Nothing." Instead she deflected. "You always ask so many questions." He turned then, his gaze unreadable. "Only when I want to know the answer." The tension between them was electric, heavy with something neither of them wanted to name. Emma knew this was dangerous. She had spent years controlling her impulses, keeping her life structured, predictable. But standing here in the fading light, with a man who saw her in a way she hadn't been seen in years, she wasn't sure she wanted to anymore. The night was warm, the air thick with the scent of hay and earth. Emma had told herself she wouldn't come back to the stables tonight. She had spent the entire day trying to shake the feeling Liam had left her with, the way his eyes lingered, the way his words carried weight. It wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, something she had been starving for. But she was here anyway, saddle in hand, because avoiding it didn't make it disappear. Midnight was restless, shifting in his stall as if he could sense her own unease. She reached out, running her hand down his side, grounding herself in the familiar. "You should let him run tonight." Her breath hitched. He turned. Liam leaned against the wooden post, arms crossed, watching her. She hadn't even heard him come in. She forced a small smile. "You always lurking in the shadows." He chuckled, stepping forward. "Just making sure you don't disappear into the night again." She swallowed, suddenly aware of how close he was. He smelled like leather and sweat and something distinctly male. Midnight stomped his hoof, the sound echoing in the quiet. "You ever think about leaving?" Liam asked, his voice lower now. The question sent a sharp pulse through her chest. "Leaving what?" He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "This life. Empty house. The waiting." She exhaled, gripping Midnight's reins tighter. "I don't know." "You do," he said softly. "You just don't say it out loud." Her throat felt tight. She had spent years convincing herself that this was the life she chose, that this was enough. But standing here, with a man who looked at her like she was something more than just someone's wife, it was hard to believe the lie. She didn't know who moved first, but suddenly his hands were on her waist, rough and warm, pulling her closer. She didn't stop him. She didn't want to. His lips were on hers before she could think. Firm, insistent, stealing the breath from her lungs. Everything blurred. His hands tangled in her hair, her body pressed against his. Heat pooling in places long neglected. She shouldn't be doing this. But the thought was distant, drowned out by the way he touched her, the way he made her feel like something more than forgotten. The stable walls held their secret, the only witnesses to the moment she crossed the line. Midnight neighed softly in his stall, as if sensing the shift in the air. When they finally pulled apart, her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shaky. Liam's eyes searched hers, waiting for regret, for hesitation. She felt neither. Instead she whispered, "What now?" Liam's fingers traced a slow line down her arm. "That's up to you." And for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she wanted to make the right choice. The house felt different when David returned. Nothing had changed, not really. His bags by the door, his voice filling the empty spaces, his usual distracted kisses. But Emma had changed. She felt it in the way she moved around him, in the way she measured her words. He sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through emails, talking about flights and meetings. She watched him, searching for something. Guilt, hesitation, anything that mirrored the storm inside her. But there was nothing. Just routine. Just distance. "You're quiet," he said without looking up. She forced a small smile. "Just tired." He nodded, already lost in something else. He never noticed the way her fingers trembled against the coffee mug. The weight of what she had done pressed against her chest. But it wasn't regret. It was something else. A realization. Shift. Later, she found herself back at the stables, drawn there without thinking. Midnight stood at the fence, ears twitching as she approached. She reached out, running her fingers down his mane, grounding herself in the familiar. "You okay?" She didn't turn. She knew his voice by now, the low timbre, the quiet concern. Liam stood a few feet away, watching her. "I don't know," she admitted. He stepped closer, his presence steady, unshaken. "I meant what I said. It's up to you." She exhaled, her fingers tightening in Midnight's mane. "It's not that simple. Isn't it?" His voice was calm, but there was something underneath, something waiting. "You don't owe anyone a life that makes you feel invisible." She closed her eyes. He was right. She had spent years convincing herself that love meant endurance, that loyalty meant sacrifice. But now she knew what it felt like to be seen, to be wanted. She turned to face him. His gaze was steady, patient, waiting for her to decide. "I don't know how to walk away," she admitted. "You don't have to know," he said. "You just have to want to." A long silence stretched between them. In the distance, she heard the house door close, David moving inside, oblivious. The life she had built was standing behind her. The life she wanted was standing in front of her. She took a slow breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the question.